James B. Cullen in the commencement address.
The Spirit of the Lord is on me, for he has anointed me to bring the good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives, sight to the blind, and let the oppressed go free. St. Luke's Gospel. As both a true patriot and man of faith, James B. Cullen has dedicated himself to a life of service. During the height of the Vietnam conflict, Mr. Cullen entered the United States Army after completing his legal studies at St. John's Law School in 1969. He would go on to have a distinguished 27-year career in the Army as an attorney with the Judge Advocate General's Corps, or JAG, retiring at the rank of Brigadier General. Having lived through the terrible conflict in the midst of the Cold War, Mr. Cullen witnessed the dreadful effects that violations of law and morality on the battlefield could have on individuals as well as national interests. The failure to hold fully accountable those responsible for the My Lai massacre in 1968 irrevocably harmed U.S. national interests during the Vietnam conflict by undermining global perceptions of the nation's moral authority. He never forgot this lesson. A generation later, during the newly established Global War on Terrorism, or GWAT, Mr. Cullen in 2004 became aware of allegations of prisoner of war abuse perpetrated by isolated members of the U.S. military at Abu Ghraib in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Concerned with the human, legal, and national implications of such violations of international conventions on the humane treatment of prisoners, Mr. Cullen was instrumental in organizing a group of retired generals and admirals in conjunction with the nonprofit organization Human Rights First to petition the U.S. government to end the abusive tactics and to establish an independent commission to conduct a full investigation. Convinced that the United States is its strongest when it abides in its highest ideals, Mr. Cullen and his group were tireless in their advocacy for protecting the human rights of these prisoners. During the 2008 presidential primaries, this group worked to meet with every candidate to press the issue to ensure that justice would be served. Their persistence and moral imperative bore fruit in January 2009 with the signing of 3 presidential executive orders banning excessive coercive interrogation techniques as well as substandard detention facilities. In recognition of his contribution to this effort, Mr. Cullen was one of the 16 retired generals and admirals invited to attend in person the White House signing. For his life of public service and for his continuing concern for defending the constitutional and human rights of all in accord with the highest traditions of country and faith, Dominican College is honored to bestow on Brigadier General James P. Cullen the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa.
Thank you very much, Sister. I'd also like to thank the President and the Board for inviting me here today to speak to you. In the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to acknowledge that the Dominican sisters taught me while I was in grammar school. Don't hold that against them. Even the wisest among us make a few bad investments. In the 60s, when I graduated from college and law school, I was not concerned about decisions and uncertainties that afflict many, including probably some here today. And the reason was family connections. I had an uncle who was going to take care of all the decisions I needed to make, from what jobs I was going to do, to But she did warn, we lived in a bad neighborhood. And they told me that I was going to be entering a community with a lot of great people, but it was going to be also populated by poor tailors, bad travel agents, and ill-tempered cooks. I soon realized there was one quality in this new community I was entering that was valued above all others. And it did not matter in this new community if your ancestors came over on the Mayflower, on a coffin ship during a famine, or on a slave galley. Only one quality mattered: trustworthiness. Could you trust the person next to you, possibly with their or her life? And could they, in turn, trust you? How do you assess trust? I would argue that adherence to ethical standards form the essential foundation of trust. Adherence to ethical standards and the consequences of the failure to adhere to those standards are concerns not confined to the military. We have all read about the crises caused by Wall Street scandals and civilian political leaders who betrayed our nation's values. Bernie Madoff's enormous thefts from vital charities, and the efforts of some politicians and bureaucrats to redefine and justify torture display a common ethical deficit. The packaging is different in most cases, but the defective product is the same. It's easy to condemn wrongful action when it's committed by a convicted criminal or by enemies of our nation. But what about when those ethical threats are closer to you? Fear, more than greed, can threaten our values, just like extreme fatigue can threaten our bodily defenses. Politicians with compromised ethical standards play upon people's susceptibility to fear, to build support for policies and actions that would be rejected out of hand if fear did not induce paralysis. When you hear any political message delivered in the language of fear, beware of what follows. Our nation and our communities face dangers, real dangers, especially those from cyber warfare today. There are evil people who would harm us, but we should never fight evil actions with methods that mirror that evil. Our nation's values are what makes us strong. Your values are what will get you through difficult and dangerous situations. The only way to deal with danger is to prepare for it. Training, resourcing, reliable intelligence, and coordination will all be necessary. You cannot prepare for or fight a war on the cheap while you peddle fear in place of preparation. You are trained in the military to follow orders. Once a commander makes a decision, soldiers are obligated to follow the orders necessary to execute that decision. But we also teach our young soldiers two other things about orders. You have an affirmative duty not to obey an illegal order, and you must report an illegal order if, after seeking clarification, you are convinced that the order remains illegal. We always tell young soldiers, as I was told, that if you believe an order is illegal, first seek clarification. The person giving the order may be from Mississippi, and the person listening to the order could be from Brooklyn. You would have a failure of communication in that instance. We know, too, that burdened by fatigue and extreme pressure, a leader can express an order without proper clarity. A question raised about that order can make the leader aware that the order is unclear and could lead to unintended consequences. You are trained in the military about duties and prohibitions based upon upon our military law and the Geneva Convention. You know, for example, that you may not kill or mistreat an enemy once that enemy surrenders or is rendered hors de combat, a French term that simply means the enemy is not able to fight any longer because of wounds or being rendered unconscious. You are also told that the proper treatment of a captured enemy can lead to reliable information that can protect your fellow soldiers and can help you achieve your mission. The experience of one remarkable man best illustrates why we should adhere to these principles and to the rule of law, even under the most trying and difficult circumstances. I was with this good man a few hours before he left us in 2010, and I shall never forget him for his quiet moral courage. Fred Haynes was a 24-year-old Marine officer from Texas who once thought about becoming a priest, but World War II intervened. He was assigned as the operations officer of the Marines Regimental Combat Team 28. They trained for a year along with other dedicated units to take an island that was only 8.5 square miles, called Iwo Jima. The battle began on February 19, 1945. It went on for 36 days. 1 out of every 3 Marines killed in action in World War II died on Iwo Jima. It was the sole campaign in the Pacific War in which American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. Before the invasion, American planes dropped leaflets on the island telling anyone there who did surrender that they would be treated properly. 3 weeks into the battle, there were no surrenders except so-called false flag incidents, in which Japanese soldiers would pretend to surrender only to shoot their captors when the captors emerged to take the captors. The only Japanese soldiers taken captive in that period were unconscious or badly wounded when taken. Some Marines had been captured and pulled into the caves of Iwo Jima, were terribly tortured and then killed by their Japanese captors. This created in the minds of the Marines that this was going to be a fight to the death in which no quarter would be given. Fred Haynes went forward with a platoon commander, Lieutenant Johnson, and Johnson's company commander, Lieutenant Captain Field Pardo, to survey access routes to the base of Mount Suribachi, a huge outcrop on the island in which the main Japanese defenses were housed. At their approach, a Japanese soldier came out of a cave, clothed only in helmet, boots, and a loincloth. He had his arms raised and he was holding in one of his hands one of the leaflets we had dropped on the island. Lieutenant Johnson probably could have shot him, and probably no one would have questioned him after the series of false flag surrenders and the torture of the Marines earlier in the battle. Rather, Johnson motioned for the man to come forward. And as soon as the Japanese soldier stood, a shot rang out. It hit Lieutenant Johnson in the helmet, convincing him, I'm sure, that indeed he was in a setup for a false flag surrender. The bullet entered at a glancing angle, hit the helmet liner, spun around inside the helmet, and dropped down his back. He was not injured. The second shot ran out almost immediately and hit the face of the cave where the Japanese soldier was emerging. Everyone dropped to the earth at that point. This time, also, the sniper's bullet had missed its mark. Fortunately, Lieutenant Johnson, who was closest to the Japanese soldier, kept his cool. He motioned for the man to crawl toward them, which he did, and a very shallow dip in the terrain allowed them all to withdraw to safety. The Japanese prisoner who surrendered that day was arguably one of the most important military prisoners taken in World War II. He was a master sergeant, but far more importantly, he was the code clerk to the commanding general of the island. He was a graduate of the University of Tokyo, the most prestigious university in the the militarists who had seized control in Japan before the war were bringing the country to a ruinous end. He felt that Japanese soldiers who were still alive would be needed to rebuild the country after the war. Only the fanatics who were still insisting on suicidal banzai charges stood in the way of the country's recovery. Sergeant Sakai could not speak English, his captors could not speak Japanese, but he and Captain Lapardo, a graduate of Notre Dame, discovered they could both speak some French. Sergeant Sakai went on to tell his captors about Japanese defenses within Mount Suribachi and plans for nighttime banzai charges on the Marines once the Americans reached predetermined levels on the mountain. Sergeant Sakai also had information about Okinawa, where we were headed next. Had Sergeant Sakai been killed or mistreated, the information that saved so many Marine lives on Iwo Jima and Okinawa would have been lost, along with those American lives. Fred Haynes subsequently went on to fight 3 wars, commanding the Marines in Korea and Vietnam. He ultimately became a Major General and Division Commander. General Haynes told that story about Iwo Jima to me and a group of other retired generals one evening in Arlington, Virginia. We had gathered there to figure out what we could and should do about the revelations emerging from Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and Bagram interrogation centers. The disclosures were numbing. Our values and the sacrifices of our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq had been defiled by policies which led to these outrages. We learned it was high-level civilians within the Justice Department and the Defense Department being orchestrated by the Vice President and people within his office who were responsible for the torture policies. General Washington had refused to retaliate against the British for their brutal treatment of Americans captured during the Revolution. Of the 2,500 American prisoners taken in New York City in 1776 when the British seized the city, only 800 were still alive a year and a half later. Some in Congress understandably demanded retaliation. General Washington refused. Rather, he ordered that British prisoners be treated properly and afforded the same medical care and food given to the American soldiers. His policy proved to be the wiser one. Many in America who were on the fence during the Revolution, backing neither the Revolution nor the Loyalists, and they were about 40% of the population in the early part of the war, came over increasingly to the Revolution when they learned about British atrocities. Just as important, 2 large British armies surrendered to us without a fight to the finish, which we could ill afford at the time, at Saratoga and then at Yorktown, because they realized they would be well treated and there would be no retaliation. The American military adopted General Washington's wisdom as its own legacy. I represented a division chaplain in the My Lai massacre investigation during the Vietnam War. Often forgotten in this tragic, shameful chapter in our history is that young soldiers, including helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson, intervened and protected some of the victims who had survived the initial shootings during the massacre, while other young soldiers did not rest until the massacre was properly investigated. Similarly, it was a young soldier at Abu Ghraib who brought photos of the torture and mistreatment he saw to the CID, which is the Army detectives. The moral antenna of these young soldiers were far better attuned than some of their national leaders. These young servicemen and women upheld General Washington's legacy and their own personal code of ethics. Your conscience is your temporal court